Freedom has a long intellectual history in the West, and it is obviously one of the core values that we hold in American culture, amplified by the upcoming 250th anniversary of our founding as a nation. Freedom, indeed, has been thought of as the sole possession of the Western intellectual and democratic traditions, originally tracing its roots back to Greece and Rome. Our guest in this episode, Prof Nabel, the Tombros early career professor of classical studies and assistant professor of classics and ancient Mediterranean studies at Penn State University, has a different story to tell about freedom. While Professor Nagel recognizes the Greek and Roman traditions of freedom, he argues that freedom also has a long history in ancient Iran, one that parallels and intersects the intellectual development of freedom in Greece and Rome. Professor Nabel and I have a lively conversation about freedom and its intellectual ancestors, and even delve into the ways studying the cultures of ancient Iran can help nuance our understanding of this region today. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Ahearne-Kroll, and this is the Future of the Past Lab, the podcast where we rethink the legacies of injustice and the study of antiquity. All right, well, welcome, Jake. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So just as a background for our listeners, how did you get interested in the study of antiquity in general, and then the study of Rome's intersection with the East in particular?
So I showed up for my first day of college in 2003 and had no earthly idea that one could even major in the study of the ancient world, still less a specific region of the ancient world. And I was lucky enough to have sort of randomly enrolled for a class with a great instructor. His name was William Mullen. He taught at Bard College, where I went. And he was just so talented at running the classroom. I would come into class and everyone would have their hand raised. He was such a dynamic and engaging instructor. And really through just the sheer magnetism of his teaching, I was drawn into the field. I was also extremely lucky that the class he was teaching my first semester was called Confucius and Socrates. So it was a comparative philosophy class reading Socratic philosophy up against the Confucian tradition from ancient China. And I didn't know at the time, of course, what a rare and creative thing that was. But subsequently, as I reflected on it, and as I, of course, became more familiar with the way that the study of the Greco-Roman world is institutionalized in universities, I came to really appreciate the way that class was conceived. And I think it always stuck with me, this notion that doing ancient Greece or doing ancient Rome was a comparative and intercultural venture, as well as one where you also wanted depth, of course, in Greece or Rome or whatever your primary interest in the ancient world was. So that's how I came to the study of antiquity. I began to take Greek, and things sort of snowballed from there. As for the Near East and the Iranian world specifically, I was in a PhD program in classics at Cornell, and that's where I did my training. And I was interested in interstate relations. It's always, one of the first Greek authors I really engaged with was Thucydides. And so ancient IR always engaged me. But I was casting around for an ancient interstate relationship that was, on the one hand, compelling, but also where I could see making a contribution of some kind to the literature, and I came upon Roman relations with the Parthian Empire, and what first attracted me there was that many of the Roman sources that I was being trained to read and that were my first port of call in antiquity, many of them were saying things like Parthia is sort of roughly as big, roughly as powerful, and the one polity out there in the world that sort of looks like Rome itself. And I found that fascinating, and that certainly wasn't an assessment that I saw scholarship really engaging with seriously, in as much as there wasn't all that much dedicated to understanding the Parthians on their own terms, from internal sources from their own empire. So I decided I'll write a dissertation on Roman-Parthian relations, and specifically it was about the transfer of so-called royal hostages from the Parthian Empire to Rome. And I loved them because they were these fascinating figures who were negotiating between these huge imperial spheres, and they were a very logical place to start looking at themes of interconnectedness and global antiquity between Rome and the Iranian world. Unfortunately, I was very ill-prepared to seriously study the Parthians because I had no serious grounding in Iranian studies. I didn't know any Iranian languages, and even the secondary literature I didn't know well. But I did some additional training. I did a sort of semester abroad as a PhD student in Germany with Josef Wiesehofer, who's a great historian of pre-Islamic Iran. Had some training in the languages there, and that's the journey I've been on ever since. As someone whose primary scholarly hat, I suppose, that I still have to wear is one of a Roman historian. I was hired to do Roman history and to teach Latin in my department, and those are my primary responsibilities still. But I also try to seriously represent Iranian perspectives, whether on interstate relations, trade, the movement of religions, and so on, and to do that on the basis of Iranian sources and not just Roman ones. So that's the ride I've been on until now, and we'll keep riding it in the future.
That sounds great. You know, just as an aside, there's so many people that I've talked to, but also that have done this podcast who have credited teachers that they've had for sending them on this road of whatever, field they're in. And it just reminds me, even though our students don't often tell us this, how much of an impact we can have on a student's future and trajectory. And, even if they don't go on in academics of any kind, it's really amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when I was in grad school, I was a New Testament PhD student and learning about the Roman first century or so during the rise of nascent Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. And I always saw on a map that the Parthians were east of where I was studying, but none of my professors ever talked about them, which was, I always wondered that and I never followed up on it. But I imagined that the Parthians would have a major impact on Judaism and, early Christianity in that region, but nobody really ever talked about it too much until, later on in late antiquity. So I was wondering if you could kind of unpack maybe why that's the case and what impact the Parthians might have had on Israel and Second Temple Judaism in that region and, early Christianity in that region.
Sure. Well, a big part of the story is a lack of sources, but there's also, I think, a historiographical problem which remains quite important. Some general background on them. They emerge from the collapse of the Hellenistic world. The basic background there is that the first great empire centered on the Iranian plateau in antiquity is the Achaemenid Empire, which of course is profoundly important and influential on the history of Judaism. That empire is conquered by Alexander of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, and he dies very quickly without any clear succession plan, but one of his generals, Seleucus, ends up ruling the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, and Syria, bits of Anatolia as well. And his descendants rule in those territories for 100, 150 years. But eventually in northeastern Iran, a rebellion begins under the command of one Arshak in Parthian, or Arsakes, as he's called in the Greek sources. We don't know all that much about him, frankly, and we will never know with certainty where he came from. He may have been a nomadic invader from the Eurasian steppe. He may have been a settled inhabitant of the province of Parthia, which is northeastern Iran. We will never know, and our sources disagree. Our sources are Roman sources, and this is a big problem, is that there is no contemporaneous internal Parthian historiographical tradition to stand as a counterbalance to the Roman sources.
Yeah.
So as far as Judaism and then later Christianity are concerned, these topics suffer from the source situation as well. We know that there were very large Jewish populations living in Babylonia by the time the Parthians conquered it around 140 BCE, but we just don't have very good high-resolution data on them. We basically have two kinds of sources. One is Josephus, a Jew from Judea who ends up living at the Flavian court, of course, in Rome, and his fortunes become interconnected with those of the Roman Empire. He certainly had access to information which other classical authors did not. For some things, he's a very precious source, but he's also a disappointing source because although he certainly had access to informants who lived under the Parthian Empire, Jews, for instance, who came from Babylonia to go to the temple in Jerusalem to pay tribute. We know that these connections existed and that such people could have served as informants for him. And yet, very disappointingly, the kind of thing that we read about the Parthians in Josephus is sort of the same kind of set of Orientalist tropes that many other classical authors give us. And Josephus doesn't really seem too interested in thinking seriously about the animating forces of Parthian politics. So it's a major disappointment in that respect. But there are, that said, there are a few pieces of testimony that he gives, which we really only get from him. For instance, the conversion of the ruling house of the Kingdom of Adiabene to Judaism. Adiabene is a dependency of the Parthian Empire, and quite an important one at that. And we really owe to Josephus knowledge of that conversion and then some of the dynamics that governed Adiabene's negotiation under Parthian rule on the one hand, and then they also had some dealings with Rome. People from that kingdom end up fighting in the Jewish revolt, for instance, against Rome. So that's a fascinating history, and we owe Josephus our knowledge of those kinds of dynamics, though, of course, we wish we had a lot more. The other sort of source is various passages from the Talmuds, both the Palestinian and the Babylonian Talmud. And the major scholar who's worked on that is Joseph Neusner, who almost single-handedly carried that banner in Judaic studies for a long time and tried to mine those sources for historical tidbits about life for Parthian Jews. To my understanding, I'm not really an expert in those passages, but to my understanding, that's been roundly criticized by subsequent scholars who think that Neusner used them in a rather too positivist sense, that he was reading these as sort of straightforward transcriptions of things that actually happened, rather than as later very invented traditions, which absolutely are valuable evidence for something. Yeah. They're valuable stories, but they're just not historical transcripts of things that actually happened in the Parthian period. Of course, as you note, in late antiquity, the situation really changes when the Jewish community of Babylonia is still around and still living a very vital and dynamic civic life. But now we have the Babylonian Talmud, and for a long time, the interpretive orientation there was to read that as just kind of a parochial set of Jewish commentaries with a relatively isolated community that didn't have much connections to its surrounding Sasanian milieu. That, to my, again, inexpert perspective, has really been changing in recent years. I would point to Simcha Gross's recent book, for instance, on the life of Babylonian Jews under Sasanian imperialism, which shows that Jews were active participants in their Sasanian milieu, that Sasanian institutions pop up in the Babylonian Talmud in all kinds of interesting ways. And this is really a story of interconnection and exchange, rather than a isolated, insulated Jewish story in this region. And of course, as far as Christianity is concerned, the fortunes of Christianity in the Roman Empire become so tightly interconnected with Constantine and later that perspective has really overpowered and made overlooked the fact that there are large Christian communities that first live in the Parthian Empire and later under Sasanian rule. That, too, has been better treated, I think, in recent scholarship by Richard Payne, for instance, Kyle Smith, both showing and using these quite neglected East Syrian, mostly hagiographical sources that show that Christians were a big and an influential population under Sasanian rule. These narratives of persecution, that the Sasanian state viewed Christians as a kind of fifth column and was out to get them, that has dominated the literature, but now has come in for revision. And it turns out that Christians, like Jews, were very much an established part of the Sasanian Empire, which incorporated them and saw a distinct place for them. So in late antiquity, these kinds of narratives and the neglect of the Iranian world is being addressed, but there, of course, evidence is more plentiful. It remains a challenge for the Parthian period because of the evidentiary situation, which plagues not just the study of Judaism and Christianity in Parthia, but the study of Parthian history in general.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's really interesting. And those later sources in the Talmuds and later Christian sources, they're so not just overlaid by, the writers who wrote them, their biases, but so much history of interpretation and why those sources are used in later times for religious purposes. And there's a narrative that goes from both early Judaism and early Christianity to the present that when you start disrupting that, I think Neusner was trying to do that to a certain extent. Whether he was successful or not, that's a debate. But I think the kind of historical work that's been done in the Bible, for instance, that is only 25 or 30 years old in other sources. The more complex that history can be, the better in the future. So.
And certainly both the Talmuds are such copious and detailed sources that there's plenty of scope for future work remaining.
Yeah, for sure. So speaking of sources, tell us about your Parthian Sources website and how it's coming along.
Yeah, it's a work in progress, though at the moment might be better said as a work in regress. I made it first as a graduate student, and the idea was mostly just purely, my motives were selfish, really. I wanted to learn Parthian and Middle Persian better. These are both Middle Iranian languages, and Parthian was the one spoken by the Arsacids and the ruling class of their empire. Middle Persian is the primary language of the Sasanians and the Iranians who came to power with them. They're very similar, and they can be studied together. I was just interested in learning what kinds of sources there were and how to think about them, and of course, how to read them. I was studying these languages and trying to become a more skilled reader of those texts. And frankly, the primary function of the site was just to get me to enter them, key them in literally, because they were not available in any kind of digital form at the time. And I was learning to read them by keying them in. And that was a big part of the methodology. I also had aspirations that it would be the kind of resource that Perseus, the Perseus Project is for Greek and Latin, where you can click on a word and a little gloss pops up, which gives you morphological information and also a dictionary entry. And I began to enter those. And at first, I was just doing those by hand. So whereas Perseus actually has a proper back end, which automates that process, I was just doing the glosses by hand. That's, of course, not the most efficient way to do it. But for me, given my language learning interest, it was really salutary, actually, and it helped me learn those languages better. And of course, the fact that now more people could have access to these sources, and Parthian and Middle Persian, in terms of ancient languages, are not grammatically very complicated. I really think someone can get up and read them intelligently with a semester of study. You won't be an expert, but you can meaningfully work with them after a few months of study. And I thought that was a dimension that deserved to be represented and supported in a public-facing resource. So that was the idea. Since then, the project has suffered from the kinds of things that plague any digital humanities project. The main one is sustaining the infrastructure. The feature that made these nice little glosses pop up is broken, and it's going to take a lot of work to get it back up and running again. I think I may just abandon that side and continue with just keying them in. There is, I should mention, if you're interested in having that kind of resolution on a word-by-word basis of Middle Persian text, there's a resource now called the MCPD, I think. It's the Middle Persian Corpus and Dictionary. I hope I've gotten that acronym right. So if you're interested in, corpus analytics, how many times a word occurs across Zoroastrian texts, for instance, and what kinds of forms it appears in, noun, adjective, verb, whatever, that's really the place to turn now. So there's not really as much of a need for me to do that kind of back-end work. But I do want to keep entering texts and making them publicly available. Probably my favorite digital humanities project to this day. I'm not sure whether it totally warrants the term, but it's probably the most used web resource out there. It's a site called Lacus Curtius, which simply is someone who, as far as I know, is not a university instructor or anything. He's just a generally engaged reader of Greek and Roman texts. And the methodology is he simply keys in out of copyright Loeb editions. And there is a really great note that he puts at the beginning of the page that many people have encouraged me to just scan and OCR this stuff because it would be a lot faster. But no thanks. I'm interested in reading these, and I gain a very in-depth perspective on them by having to reproduce them, by having to key them in. That's a very slow and not optimized methodology, but there is a real logic to that, I think. I'm not going to go to quite such lengths, but keying the text in myself and commenting on them probably will be part of the work in the future.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, and doing things as a graduate student, like you said, is a great way to learn things. But once you embark on your professional career, things take over, and
that's right.
You don't have as much time to do that.
And for digital projects, part of maintaining them, doing the work responsibly is figuring out a long-term data plan and investing in platforms that will be sustainable. And there are many projects that got funding, 2014 to 2018 or so that use outdated technologies for which there is no longer good browser support, and they're offline. And you can get money and grants to do things once, to conceive of an original project, but it's a lot harder to apply for a grant to say, I have this project which already exists, but now I need money to renovate it. That's a little bit less attractive to the people who give out money for grants. So I'm not sure what the right answers to this set of problems might be, but we'll find out going forward.
Yeah, for sure. So your new project is on the concept of freedom in ancient Iran. Can you give us a sense of why you think this is an important aspect of the development of the idea of freedom in the ancient world into the later periods?
So the most important intervention in the literature, I would say, simply is to combat the idea that the only ancient cultures who are seriously thinking about freedom and seriously invested in the concept as an important political value are those of Greece and Rome. And this is a long-standing attitude. Of course, it originates in, very Eurocentric 19th century scholarship, which nobody puts a whole lot of investment in today, at least not people working in universities. But it's proven a very resilient idea and difficult to correct. So in edited volumes on ancient freedom that have come out, over the last 5 years, let's say, there will usually be a chapter on some ancient Near Eastern culture now, and that didn't used to be the case. So that's major progress. And of course, I have to point to the work of Minnesota's own Eva von Dassau in this regard. So there is some correction going on, but still, in a typical edited volume on this theme, there will be 1 or 2 chapters on Near Eastern cultures, and then 5 to 10 on Greece and Rome each. So the imbalance is still quite serious. And the main intervention of the project is to seriously treat the Iranian world because, as I hope to show, the Iranian evidence simply shows that this notion that no ancient Near Eastern culture is seriously thinking about freedom and invested in it, I think the Iranian evidence flatly contradicts that idea. So that's the main intervention I hope to make.
And your initial thesis, it's mainly an elite value, is that correct?
That's right. Well, I make a distinction between political freedom and legal freedom. Okay. Legal freedom is simply non-slavery. That's important, of course, and the interconnected history of freedom and slavery is a very important dimension of the topic. However, legal freedom is not necessarily the kind of value which elites are embracing and adopting because in any ancient culture, it could be from the ancient Near East or Greece or Rome, there are lots of people who are legally free. That is to say, they're not in a condition of chattel slavery, but they're also not very important people. You can still have a very low and menial social status and be legally free. Yeah. So there's a different kind of freedom that Iranian elites invest in. I call it political freedom. There may be better ways of articulating that concept, but I think that one really captures the terminology in the Iranian evidence. And this is, yes, freedom not only to exercise power over oneself and one's own path in life and one's own fortunes, but the power to rule, the power to use governmental power to manage the lives of other people. And often that power is imperial in nature. So I want to emphasize this is a long way away from freedom as the universal value that we cherish today. We who live in liberal democracies, at least for the time being. Yeah. It's very different from what a modern person might understand when they think of freedom. So it's certainly not a roadmap for where we might want to go, but it is a vital, very engaged, and a very deep political tradition, and I think it is abundantly represented in late antique Iranian sources especially.
Have you taught much on this in your courses at Penn State?
I have not, no. I have taught Middle Persian. I've been extremely lucky to have had very bright and diligent and interested students who came to me and asked, I understand you do these Middle Iranian languages. Can we do an independent study in them? So to my amazement, the first time I taught it was 1 student, then the second time was 2, and then it was 4. So
Great.
That's been incredible. And I've also done independent studies on Iranian history broadly construed. I have never taught a specific seminar in ancient political thought or a comparative history of political thought in the Near East and Rome. Hope to do so in the future, but for now it's a research interest. And my primary teaching hats are the Latin language. Roman history is the big one that I tend to cover. But of course, eventually I hope to better represent the Iranian world in the classroom as well as in the pages of publications.
Yeah. The reason I ask is that when I teach my New Testament classes, the language of freedom comes up a lot, especially in Paul's letters. And students are always surprised that this isn't the kind of freedom that we're thinking about. There's no sort of equal opportunity, rights for all sort of idea. And that's oftentimes one of the more shocking things, not just about freedom, but about the way that modern people think about the ancient world. They just, tend to, when they see these categories, they assume they're the same and they're not. and trying to unpack that and talk about the ramifications of that. It can be really complicated, and especially with religious texts, it can be really hard for people to understand that, and not just understand, but hard to accept that as, a major difference from what they're used to when they're engaged with the text on their own terms,
Yes. Yes, I absolutely agree. And it's a major part, not just of, New Testament studies, which is not my field, but I think doing the ancient world, the history of democracy, the history of comparative political thought, all of these things, there are admirable ideas. There are ideas in our ancient texts that we want to engage with and that can serve as an inspiration, but we have to acknowledge the social structures in which these people were writing, which is vital context. I mean, the history of Greek democracy, I think, is another place where this is absolutely pivotal and very often unacknowledged in a very large literature, which sees Athenian democracy as a model to emulate. These kinds of social settings are absolutely crucial to acknowledge.
Yeah. In our Exploring Assumptions of Cultural History series, for which you're a guest this week, and the Future of the Past Lab, we've been trying to bring to light Western perspectives that lurk under the surface of so much scholarship and thinking about the ancient world. So how does your work on freedom in ancient Iran, in comparison to traditional views of the development of freedom, challenge those Western models and assumptions about freedom?
So there is, of course, the very well-known view that the lineage of the West includes ancient Greece and Rome, and really no other ancient cultures really matter to that tradition. What I'm hoping to show is that ancient Greece and Rome were not the only ancient cultures that were thinking about freedom. Iran was doing it, and of course other scholars have covered other parts of the ancient Near East. Now, whether Western civilization remains an analytically useful category, that's rather a different question. And I have to say, I'm not always totally satisfied with the kind of discourse that I see about that historical construct in our field. There are some scholars who write about this topic and say Greece and Rome are the supposed progenitors of Western Civ. And Western Civ goes in scare quotes to show that the author is aware that this is a contested construct and that they are distancing themselves from it and not adopting it themselves. Now, sometimes they're admirably clear that they don't think this is a useful way to analyze world history and it's best abandoned. And they explicitly say that. And I'm always grateful when they say that because, okay, at least now I know where you stand on this issue. But many others allude to this idea and sort of signal that they're skeptical that ancient Greece and Rome are the progenitors of the West. Is it because they don't believe in Western civilization? Is that because Western civilization has broader roots in other ancient cultures as well? Where exactly do you come down on this issue? And I kind of think it's more important for people in ancient studies to engage seriously with the concept. That's partly simply for practical reasons. I think we're sort of stuck with it in a way. Certainly when I read Iranian media, for instance, and I'm much less familiar with modern China than Iran, but when I read engagement about world politics in Iranian media or China or India, the West is taken very seriously as an important force in global politics. And it has a very concrete meaning for commentators who are not in America or Europe. So what is our view? What would we say to those people? You're simply barking up the wrong tree and you're dedicated to analyzing an illusion which simply doesn't exist. I'm not sure I agree with that, and I'm not sure it's productive to totally abandon the idea. Now, of course, we can still be skeptical. We can still keep our distance. No one has to invest in the concept if they don't find it useful, but I think we should be clear about where we come down on the issue exactly. So in terms of the history of ancient freedom, I'm not entirely sure at the moment. It's something I need to think more about, whether the fact that Iranians are also thinking about freedom, does that mean that they're also contributors to the Western tradition? Does it mean that the history of Greek freedom is not as insular a story as we might think it is? And certainly that's something I hope to talk about tomorrow a little bit, that Greek freedom is not something that emerges in the classical period and then stays there only to neatly transfer to Rome and it doesn't engage with any other part of the ancient world. The story of the Hellenistic age is one of Greek colonization, settlement, and domination of lands where Greeks did not live originally. And I think that's part of the history of Greek freedom. So whether one wants to invest in the concept of Western Civ or not, I think the idea that ancient Greece and Rome are the only contributors to it, that needs to be challenged, and we need broader, more capacious, and more textured histories of antiquity. And certainly there's probably nowhere this is more true than political thought.
Yeah.
Because if Western civ means anything, it's an intellectual tradition. And the concepts that are important from the world of ancient Greece, freedom and democracy not least, these are not isolated stories confined to the Greek world. They have broader histories, and I think that's something we should press harder to reconstruct.
Yeah. Do you have any interaction or knowledge of contemporary Iranian scholars that are thinking about the history of freedom in that region as well, and how the recipients of that sort of development for themselves in that context, regardless of whether the Western concept of freedom affects that in a major way or not?
So the Iranian word for freedom is, or Persian, I should say. I'm used to talking about Middle Iranian languages. The modern language is Persian, of course. The Persian word for freedom is azadi. There's a great book by Arundhati Roy called Azadi, and it's a fascinating study of the concept. She's interested in it in the Kashmir region, where, as she discusses, people on both sides of this conflict have adopted it as a slogan for freedom and liberation. And it's such an important word in recent Iranian history. It is an important slogan in the Islamic Revolution when it's launched in 1979. Remains important throughout the Iran-Iraq War. It also, in recent years, of course, has been one of the animating forces behind Zan Zindagi Azadi, woman, life, freedom. And so both the opposition and the established government in Iran invest in the concept and think it's important and see it as a model for a political order. So I think it's absolutely vital to contemporary Iranian politics. Of course, I should preface all that by saying I'm not an expert in that setting. I've made every effort to learn modern Persian and inform myself and keep up with Persian media, though scholars of modern Iran will know much more than I do. But I do see that tradition as stretching all the way back to antiquity. And the word continues to circulate in Iran and in its adjacent territories. And I think it will be an important concept going forward as well.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I mean, this is kind of way off topic, but interesting to me. So how does those Iranian scholars that are thinking about freedom now, and then the social movements that are adopting those concepts of freedom in Iran, how would those compare to, parallel movements or parallel thoughts of freedom in this country? I mean, because it's such a huge thing. Freedom from tyranny is basically driving the far right concerns now. And, there's a freedom from something or a freedom to do something in that context. Is that similar to what's going on in Iran now, or?
Well, it depends who you ask, I suppose. The distinction between freedom from and freedom to is a really important one, and it's long figured in the literature on freedom. I think the liberal notion of freedom, and I mean liberal not in the sense of allied with the Democratic Party, but the liberal tradition of political thought, that's been more important in the States and probably was to the framers of the Constitution, that really what we're interested is freedom from governmental interference in our lives, whether that's regarding possession of firearms or speech or assembly or whatever. That's a basket of rights, which in the Western political tradition is called negative freedom.
Yeah.
And that remains very important and arguably much more important in the contemporary American context than positive freedom, which is the right to do things, to actively use power to manage one's community and to wield power in the pursuit of politics. Arguably, that's a much more authentic treatment of freedom in the ancient Greek context, or at least many have seen it that way. Which one of these dominates in which Iranian freedom tradition? I'm not sure, frankly. I think among the woman life freedom movement and the people who espoused it, I would think negative freedom is probably more important than positive freedom. Things like mandatory hijab, for instance. That would be freedom from government regulation of an area of social life, which is a private, personal decision. But here I think I should not talk out of school and without a good textured understanding of these things as modern phenomena rather than ancient ones. I'm not sure. But I think maintaining the distinction and thinking harder about negative freedom, freedom from, and positive freedom to do things. Americans are much more predisposed to think about the former than the latter. Yeah. And when we look at how the concept plays out on the global stage, we have to keep both in mind.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I won't grill you about modern Iran anymore. So maybe I will, one more question here. But do you see anything in your work that can inform sort of the recent histories of Western incursion into the Middle East? If so, how do you see that coming into play?
It's a great question. I'm happy to be grilled on it, though I'm not sure how useful the grilling will be, but I'll try to offer my thoughts, and I do have a few. One issue that came to the fore rather recently, of course, in the States, we have the prince in exile of the Pahlavi dynasty, Reza Pahlavi, and he is hoping to enter Iran and is hoping for regime change there. There was a New Yorker article which made the claim, never in Iran's 2,500-year history has any ruler sought foreign aid to install him on the throne or to overthrow the government of Iran. As many pointed out, that's not true.
Yeah.
And some of the counterexamples are ancient. I wrote a book about a set of Arsacid, not exiles, that's the wrong word, but a set of Arsacid royal princes who grow up in the Roman Empire, and several of them go back to Parthia. They don't do this necessarily as the result of Roman military intervention, although in one case that's certainly very helpful. In any event, if you look to the ancient world, there are clear counterexamples to this trend. That's simply one way that this has manifested in the discourse recently. But on a more general level, I would say the Iranian world has been the center of an imperial formation for a very long time. Empires that have had roots on the Iranian plateau have been very successful in projecting power in other regions of the ancient Near East and in Central Asia. That is a dynamic which continues, I would say. It may take different forms. Iran supports proxies in places now. It doesn't necessarily territorially administer those places, but the existence of a strong polity on the Iranian plateau that can project power outside of it. I think if you look at Iranian antiquity, that's not a surprising thing to see at all. And what would be surprising if that condition were to evaporate. And I think the prosecutors of America's current war on Iran are hoping for a weak Iran that cannot project power. And historically, I think that's a very difficult objective to achieve.
Yeah.
We'll see, of course, but in world historical perspective and in the deep history of the Iranian plateau, that's a difficult dynamic to envision. I also think that in the modern Iranian national consciousness, pre-Islamic Iran remains a very vital and important part of their identity. Of course, the current government, which is an Islamic theocracy, has been a little ambivalent about its relationship with the ancient past because, of course, it's a pre-Islamic past that predates the Arab conquest and the advent of Islam on the Iranian plateau. But in the war between Iran and Israel, not the current one, but the one from last summer, there was a piece of Iranian propaganda that circulated very widely on social media that showed Shapur I on horseback. And in the guise of a Roman emperor, the Roman emperor in question is Philip the Arab. This image comes from a very famous relief that Shapur I set up at the site of Naqsh-e-Rustam in southwestern Iran. Netanyahu took on the guise of that kneeling Roman emperor, kneeling at the feet of an Iranian king. And this was a widely publicized image. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the totality of the Iranian self-conception these days is based on the ancient world, of course, but it remains really vital and an important strand of the tradition. And so I think it's important to keep studying that history, to look at the engagement of Iran and the Roman Empire, which rightly or wrongly is often conflated with the modern West. That's one of the intellectual moves that we don't want to simply accept by rote. Through force of habit, but we do want to examine the analogy and be prepared to think about it. And those are distinct objectives to my mind, and I think we should do the latter. We shouldn't, of course, automatically accept it, but we should be prepared to think through the analogy a bit further. So I think these are various ways that ancient Iranian history remains important. And as they say, even if the present doesn't simply reproduce the conditions of the past, it rhymes. There are certain patterns that pop up, and we should be attentive to those if we want to more ably and capably meet the challenges of the present moment.
Yeah. Well, finally, for all those grad students and recent PhDs who are struggling to find their way in academia, do you have any advice or thoughts for them?
Sure, a few things. And that's an important question. I appreciate it because few things are more important in a university setting these days. One thing I would say is prepare yourself not to have the kind of job that your advisor has. You will not be simply replicating established university positions. Even if you do land a tenure-track job in the professoriate, the things that you'll be asked to do will be very different from the generation that preceded you. You'll have to, of course, figure out a way to maintain research and teaching excellence in your field, because that will always be important and that will never go away. But in addition to specialist training and the kind of basic stuff which is central to scholarship, you're going to have to do things like justify your budget. You will have to keep tabs on your graduates, on your majors, see what sorts of fields they go on to, how much money they're making, how what you're teaching them supports their future economic and professional success. You're going to have to do more with less. You'll have to take probably a shrinking pool of faculty, a shrinking pool of specialists on the ancient world, and figure out how to try to maintain the excellence in research and the kinds of specialization that previous scholars before you were prepared to offer. So those are incredible challenges, of course, but I think they're going to confront anyone who has a job in the professoriate going forward. Another maybe more practical nuts and bolts thing would be keep alert to employment opportunities at the nexus of administration and either research scholarship or teaching. Teaching is the more likely of those two, I think. The university is the one kind of the administrative side of the university is kind of the one growth industry of the institutional landscape.
Yeah, for better or for worse, right?
Probably for worse. But as simply as a practical matter. And I do know, friends from graduate school who have gone on to jobs like instructional designer, for instance, where these are very rewarding and compelling jobs where you get to do a lot of interesting work that your PhD has prepared you for. You get to design educational content. You are a teacher. And that's, of course, one of the things that a PhD prepares you to do. But that's combined very often with administrative work, with doing things like, for instance, figuring out teaching standards or assessment standards in online teaching, which seems to be another area that's expanding. At least in our university, there seems to be a lot of interest in it and a growing market for it. So that's something that combines administrative work with the kind of nuts and bolts research and teaching that a PhD still prepares you to do very well. I think people who are on the market now should keep alert to those kinds of opportunities. And there's going to be scope also to carve out a unique niche for yourself somewhere in the nexus of those two spheres, because administrative positions are still multiplying, whereas faculty ones are shrinking. But there's real scope there, I think, to do something new and to envision a new kind of role for yourself. And that will be important as well. And then the last piece of advice I suppose I would have is for specifically those engaged in the study of the ancient world, be prepared to engage with theoretical apparatuses from other fields, sociology, political science, anthropology, because you may compete for a job in a classics department or a Near Eastern Studies department or a biblical studies department. There are still some such things. They seem to be shrinking, and we have to see how the next few years go. But, if I were a betting man, I would think that there's probably going to be fewer of them in 5 years than there are now. If I had to guess, I hope that's not the case, of course, but it seems likely. So if you are a scholar of ancient Greek history, your ability to talk to and engage with and participate in the disciplinary debates of a political scientist or an anthropologist or sociologist, that may be really crucial to your ability to land a job doing what you love. And it doesn't mean that you need to neglect the skills that are the traditional basis for your field. You still need to do Greek epigraphy and read all the ancient Greek literary sources you can and think seriously about them. But you need to be prepared to look at those through theoretical perspectives from the broader social sciences. That's an impossibly difficult set of concerns to manage in a way. Because the traditional way that a PhD in Greek philology was set up was just about a pure reading of the text. Sometimes people might apply a theory of reading from comp lit or something like that. But now I think it's more important than ever to be prepared to participate in broad intellectual debates across the College of Liberal Arts. And it will really help you on the market if you can do that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your insights and your work and joining us today.
It's been a blast. Thank you.
This has been a production of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota's Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures. Our recording engineer is Jonathan Prestrud at the College of Liberal Arts Language Center at the University of Minnesota. Visit futureofthepastlab.com to learn more about how we are rethinking the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. If you wish to support this podcast and the work of the Future of the Past Lab, click on the donate button on our website.